I am Jean Garrison, and I direct the Center for Global Studies at the University of Wyoming.
And I'm Stephanie Anderson. I'm head of the School of Politics, Public Affairs, and International Studies. And we were pleased to welcome Alexander Heffner, host of PBS's The Open Mind, as a keynote speaker for a program on civil discourse at the University of Wyoming. We asked Alexander and the panel that follows to come to campus because we wanted to make sure that Wyoming's voice was heard as part of this national discussion. Wyoming students have only known extreme partisanship in national politics. Nothing could be more important to the future of American democracy than to make sure that young people are part of this conversation.
This event is part of the Wallop Civic Engagement Project and UW's Presidential Engagement Initiative to reach out to the state. We want to thank Wyoming PBS for partnering with us to make this program possible. We hope you enjoy the discussion. Alexander Heffner is the host of The Open Mind on PBS. He is the co-author of a documentary history of the United States, which is published from Penguin in 2018. Actually, it's available for sale outside in the auditorium lobby. The Open Mind is a nationally broadcast public affairs interview program and the longest running in the history of American public television. First broadcast in May of 1956, this thoughtful excursion into the world of ideas across politics, media, technology, the arts, and realms of civic life is broadcast from New York City nationally through 200 PBS affiliates. To ensure geographic diversity and representation, Alexander travels around the country. So he's been to a number of places. I believe he's in Missouri. Fairly recently, he's been to MIT, and we're very pleased that he's here at the University of Wyoming tonight. He's actually been in classes over the last couple of days, and it's been really nice to have him be interacting with Wyoming students. Alexander has covered American politics, civic life, and millennials for leading newspapers and magazines, and his work has been profiled in the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Los Angeles Times. A native New Yorker, he's a graduate of Harvard. The keynote is followed by a panel discussion featuring three notable Wyoming public servants who can provide a Wyoming perspective on this discussion. The panelists include Marilyn Kite, former Justice of the Wyoming Supreme Court, who also served a term as the Chief Justice of the court. Mr. Tim Stubson, former member of the Wyoming House of Representatives. He's a graduate of the University of Wyoming College of Law. He's also a graduate in International Studies. Let me note that Marilyn Kite is also a graduate of the University of Wyoming in International Affairs. Affie Ellis is a member of the Wyoming Senate from Cheyenne and a former Assistant Attorney General of Wyoming. She's a graduate of the Colorado School of Law, please forgive her, but she's also a graduate of the political science. I want to note this because all three are graduates of the School of Politics, Public Affairs, and International Studies here at the University of Wyoming, and I think that's terrific. The three questions I want you to think about as a starting point are these. What are possible prescriptions to correct the vicious cycle of this polarized political debate that we are experiencing today? I would note this is nothing new in American politics, however. How can our footprint translate into pro-social instead of anti-social behavior? And third, how can the press restore faith in our civic life and the construction of public policy? Please help me give a warm Wyoming welcome to Alexander Heffner to discuss civil discourse in an uncivil age, the quest for a post-partisan citizenship. Alexander.
Thank you all very much, and I really want to extend my thanks to Jean and to Stephanie at the school here, who have been wonderfully gracious, warm, and hospitable to this Yankee from the Northeast. And I have exit signs there in case I'm shooed away. But I've been so delighted to engage with your students. So most of all, I want to thank the students who are here in the audience and the students who might be viewing this live on YouTube and the students I interacted with over the course of 2 days of classes, really remarkable people. I've talked about those three questions that Jean presented over the course of the 2016 campaign, but really predating that campaign and predating the electricity of toxic partisanship and polarization that have so skewed and dominated our politics in recent years. Since we started with those three questions, I want to open with three quotes that I think can help frame this conversation. Three quotes, I might add, that my grandfather, who was the original host of The Open Mind at PBS and the founding host, imparted to me as a young person learning American history and most recently updating the book that Gene referenced. First was something that he heard growing up and from one particular professor, Barnard College in New York, which was the inspiration for the program. Keep an open mind, but not so open that your brains fall out. I think that's really pivotal today because the part of our brains that are splattered seemingly on the floor are that civic creed, that code, that rallying cry of American citizenship that can be pluralistic and at the same time united in a certain value system. We're going to get to that in a moment. The second quote, paying homage to the would-be name of your state that I learned, a possible name for these beautiful lands here, from Abraham Lincoln, a quote attributed to him, and if you follow me on Twitter, you'll see that quote right in my bio, and it's been there for the last several years, even before this crisis of dis or misinformation. When new views become true views, I'll accept them. And there's some variations of those words that he echoed time and time again. But I think that in a climate where our media and politics are destabilizing our capacity to be literate, that objective of literacy, mutual collective understanding of the challenges we face as local entities, as neighborhoods, as counties, as states, as a nation, there could be no more important recognition that, yes, we live in a protean state, a culture, a constitution that has been embellished on to perform the function of that preamble to perfect this union. And I recently recorded a little promo for my program, which I had never done because we're pretty austere in our format, one-on-one conversations, but I indicated that the program's goal is a quest to better or to preserve, protect, we know defend the union, but I would add perfect the union because that really is our constitutional impetus. The third quote has been attributed to native Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, my native New York, and there's some variation on it, but you're entitled to your own opinion, but not your own facts. And so while the facts on the ground, the political climate, science, news as it is evolving are things that are recognized on a day-by-day basis, and GDP rises and falls, unemployment rises and falls. Those are clear facts. We need to ensure that the foundation of literacy in our civic identity, the foundation, the bedrock, is that established knowledge. And there seems to be an assault today in the media sphere and the political sphere on established knowledge. And Gene was referencing this idea, well, hasn't there been a disunion in this country before? The crisis of incivility is not new from the American perspective. There was a civil war. There have been marches to civil society that have included civil discourse, civil disobedience, civil speech engagement. It's not a new concept that we're addressing dispute, whether it was over slavery years ago or the movement towards civil rights and full empowerment, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, and later on the security of our people, our ability to vote, our ability to assemble, our ability to practice our religion, irrespective of what we look like. And so it's my stipulation that civility is not just some kind of norms, decency, honor, values. It's really the underpinning and the essence of what we need to be if we're going to preserve and perpetuate a civil society in the United States. And so I've identified over the course of my work in media and politics 3 impediments, 3 obstacles, 3 barriers that I think fall into this classification of incivility. And there are some chickens and there are eggs, and I think the correlation is a subjective question, but I see them as bigotry, obstructionism, and dysfunction. And I see them on the national stage. You can see them in state houses. There's more one-on-one interaction, which I think we'll get to later on in the panel, which means that we do have to be more civil to each other when we're engaging and interacting with our neighbors who are serving in the state senate or who are editors of the newspaper. When things are nationalized, it becomes more challenging. And so the crisis of uncivil bigotry, I think, has led us to a point of obstruction. What do I mean by that? I mean that there's not just a bigotry along racial lines or ethnic lines that's been spurred by rhetoric from our president or rhetoric from past political office holders or media, but it's been a downward cycle that has degraded and dumbed down our capacity to learn from each other as human beings. And instead, that bigotry, an intellectual bigotry against people who don't believe exactly what we do or you do or your family does. So it's across the world of ideas, it's across geographies, it's across racial and ethnic lines, but I think that when you can't engage with someone because they're a Republican or a Democrat, you find yourselves ensnared in this constant impasse. I call it obstruction. And we've seen that play out in the American political system in different situations, with Supreme Court appointments, proceeding with a process that is dependent upon what your political affiliation is. And it's happened to both parties, and it's happened over a period of time where that process has been degraded. And I would point to an episode of The Open Mind I recorded with Harvard Law School Dean Martha Minow that I was just watching earlier this morning preparing for this talk that really gives insight into the politicization of a process that is supposed to be deliberate, building bridges of understanding, listening to a prospective nominee, and then ultimately advising and consent on. That's one example of where I think the obstruction has been most visible. Ultimately, if you look at approval ratings, both of our chief executive and of our Congress on the federal level, it's dysfunction. It's an incivility of dysfunction. So how can you have a civil society when the people who are supposed to be represented in these institutions of government lack a feeling or a stake of empowerment in a culture that has grown to prove, to serve the interests of aristocrats and oligarchs and not the people. And that's really the perception, whether a Democrat or Republican has been in the Oval Office in the last decade. The perception has been a majority of this country is not content, is not satisfied, and that to me is one indication of dysfunction. But another indication of dysfunction is the kind of expressions of bigotry, whether it was hating on Mexicans and from one candidate during the campaign or Mexican Americans, or whether it was hating on Middle America, the West, or people who are irredeemable, deplorable. It's been on both sides. This crisis of the way we're speaking to each other is not wanting to learn from each other about what's the causal relationship with your views on issues and how we ought to construct a forward-thinking public policy incorporating conservative, liberal, and centrist ideas along the way. And so I want to really present to you the crisis as I see it from the point of view of someone who operates in the contemporary media environment. I think that over the course of the 2016 campaign and the ensuing months, these phenomena were further exacerbated by a media that is deeply polarized and that feeds the beast of what the latest tweet is all-consuming, not the substantive work of or business of the government to serve the interests of the people and to focus on areas of policy that can be prescriptive in solving problems or not adding to problems. And that is, to me, the core problem when you have a media and a politics that are furthering the entrenchment of ideological gridlock and orthodoxy instead of finding opportunities for conversation. So my format on the Open Mind is one-on-one and is really intended to solicit, whether it's Bernie Sanders, who I had on, or within the last several years, or Mitch Daniels, Republicans, Democrats. The format, the essence of my program is not to read the latest tweet and identify that controversy and, what has been generated as a function of contemporary media, specifically Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, owned by Google, of course, is an outrage machine that does produce an antisocial, not pro-social media context. In real time, that means that over the course of the 2016 campaign, folks were sowing discontent, not just people outside of this country who have been identified as Russian interference, but people in this country who thought it was more important to rev up a disinformation campaign about the political party they oppose than seeking to find common ground. And those websites that I just identified, while they have understood the importance, at least attempted to understand in recent congressional testimonies and some action on the part of Facebook, in general, they continue not to be where they should be. One thing that's not going on ad nauseum, as it was during the campaign and subsequent months, was the monetization of the political rage and disinformation that was feeding the further evidence that we saw every day on the mainstream media of tweets and counter tweets from our president, from folks who are engaging with the president, and then from all the actors who are further inciting division on social media. And so for many months leading up to the campaign, you could advertise on social media, not be identified, and proliferate hate, disinformation. There have been recorded episodes of that. But worst of all, you had the opportunity to make money if you ran YouTube ads or Facebook ads or Twitter ads, and in the process of providing this disservice to our democracy, to degrade our literacy and our common values, the result was people not only feeding a hate machine, but making money off of it at the same time. In 2 weeks I have on the program the vice president of Google News. He's one of several vice presidents, but he's the person responsible for ensuring that Google remains free and open under what has been an assault on specific journalists and freedom of the press. And I am by no means suggesting that a regulatory framework, anything other than what we have for television operators, is something that might be considered to ensure that this ad is paid by X entity or X candidate, X organization, which is still not a requirement when folks run ads on social media. I think that along with the First Amendment being preserved, we ought to preserve transparency. So some of that is recognizing the FCC is played by certain rules when it comes to television, which haven't been applied in the current technological environment. We hope that in the wake of some of these crises that have emerged, there will be self-regulation, and I can talk more about that in some of the questions you may have about particular episodes of disinformation, misinformation, their removal from YouTube or other platforms, and what that means. I talked about 3 quotes that I think are helpful in framing the civility problem or incivility problem. I just mentioned 3 particular, I think, trends or difficulties that we have that can be identified as a source of incivility: the dysfunction, obstruction, bigotry. Well, I want to talk about solutions in the time I have left up here. And solutions in also the same manner, 3 solutions. It's obvious from our politics that we don't engage each other in civil discourse. We don't even engage each other anymore if we're not from that party or that disposition. When I was based at Franklin Pierce University as a Fitzwater Fellow in the run-up to the 2016 campaign, we came up with a model called primary dialogue. And at that point, there were candidates from both parties. I had interviewed some of them on my program before they announced or declared their candidacies. New Hampshire PBS was obviously involved in inviting us in conversation with campaigns and candidates. And we thought that it would be remarkably healthy and an antidote to the toxicity of that moment and the rhetoric that was beginning to come out for an exchange of ideas around a table representing both parties. And we got buy-in from candidates of both parties. Ultimately, those candidates who agreed to participate in our primary dialogue, which is going to be co-hosted by Franklin Pierce, New Hampshire PBS, myself involved, along with the director of the Fitzwater Institute, became aware that candidates who accepted our invitation received warnings from the RNC and DNC that they shouldn't be participating. And if they do, they'll be barred from entering in the sanctioned RNC and DNC events, which are, of course, the big jackpots when it comes to building your name, your ID recognition around the state, even though, of course, like here, New Hampshire is quite interested in retail politics and meeting folks that you vote for. The three models for correcting our uncivil discourse, I think, start with that understanding that we can't operate in a politics where we enable those once wedged issues, whether they were abortion, reproductive rights, capital punishment, life, death, the NFL, kneeling at the flag. These issues are not central. They're important, but we can't, even if we disagree powerfully, we can't allow them to stymie our ability to really engage with each other. When we think about the issues that most value, that really have most value to our communities, education, healthcare, that we're treating each other, our neighbors, our peers, our friends, our family with dignity, that if we're contributing to our, the collective betterment or perfection of this union, that folks ought to recognize that in blue states and red states, we may choose to govern differently in certain jurisdictions, and yet we can, and we should be able to have dialogue. So that was the origin of the primary dialogue model, which failed because we didn't do it. We solicited feedback from citizens and students and got a lot of strong energy in what is an independent, fiercely independent state, libertarian like your own here. But ultimately, we didn't bring it to fruition because of the all-powerful DNC and RNC. The second model from a media perspective that I would encourage us to look at in facing the threat or confronting the threats of bigotry, obstruction, and dysfunction and uncivil discourse would be the recognition on the part of folks in the media that we have to be constructive actors in the perpetuation of our civil public life. And that means that those public officials who are most committed to problem solving, for instance, there's a problem solvers caucus that my hometown representative happens to belong to, along with a co-chair from Oklahoma. It's a diverse constituency. There are folks representing us who are committed to a vision of bridge building towards consensus and compromise and ultimately a collective good. One idea that I'll throw at you is really giving life to the patriots in our civic life, giving a show, giving an hour on network television, cable television, radio, podcast, whatever the platform might be that you listen to or view or read, giving a chance for folks who are committed to bipartisan cooperation, the limelight. You notice on the cable operators, you often have guests who further distance ourselves from any potential of that kind of learning experience, how the other half lives. And I think, I've used the example before of two senators, for instance, doing a reality show where you wake up with them and each week you see the process of governing. I mean, if we elected a reality TV star who a lot of folks thought would lose the ideological orthodoxy in favor of a more pragmatic approach, don't we need, if our entertainment culture is amusing us to death, don't we need to find sources of nutrition in our media that are going to give a platform to real problem solvers and dedicated stewards of that common good from across the country? So I had used examples of people that had been committed to bipartisan cooperation. I'd use the example of Pat Leahy and John McCain, but you could go to Joe Manchin in West Virginia, you could go to Susan Collins of Maine, but you could go in an earlier era of our politics to Alan Simpson, right here, whom I called as a high school student and asked if he would be an advisor to a newborn publication called Scoop 08. And he, along with Gary Hart, right here next to you, decided, we're going to sign up to advise these students reporting on the 08 campaign. And I bring that up because, of course, McCain and his own family were the first to acknowledge his shortcomings, but celebrating his life, we recognize that in that moment, in the 2008 campaign, he did put country before partisan or even his own campaign in that cause, when he told a woman in the crowd in the most civil and maybe the most notable civil moment of our politics in the last decade, no. President Obama is an honorable family man. Then Senator Obama is an honorable family man. He's not an Arab, he's not a Muslim. And he said, you got that wrong. And you look at the current rendition of our partisan politics that exploit tribal allegiance, but also sometimes lies, falsehoods, mistruths in pursuit of appeasing or appealing to base politics, going back to primary dialogue. So we talked about primary dialogue. Now we talked about this idea of the media encompassing the constructive perspectives when we see them bringing us down to our, punching at the gut and not really thinking analytically about problem solving. And the third is something I bring up in any classroom that I ever go to, and that is back to that fundamental literacy, because I don't think we can possess or retain civility if we don't care about being honestly informed and coming to some conclusive outcomes that are, facts. And so something as simple as encouraging folks to be discerning, discriminating readers or navigators of the internet, something I was taught at a young age at the advent of kind of being a very old millennial, the inception of Google, that no, you're not just going to search a term on Google. At the time I was taught, you should search a term on Google and then discriminate against all sites except for orgs or edus. And that was because at the time, those sites were most reliable when we didn't have a robust Wikipedia, which is an exception to that rule, that we wanted, reliable, credible organizations to inform folks. And that was the admonition and advice of librarians from an early age for me, but it speaks to, I think, a difficulty we have in accepting that, yes, the First Amendment, just like, and I want to get at this in a second, our kind of capitalistic core as a society, we have to always preserve that, and I think that's indelibly preserved in our nature. But the idea that the internet, those websites, those social platforms that I alluded to before, have no kind of classification system of saying, this is nonfiction, this is fiction. If you go into a library, if you go into a bookstore, if you go into a doctor's office, they're going to look at the truth, the expert assessment. If there's some subjective measure to be made, you're going to be using the scientific process to judge how to treat someone's condition or what advice to give them. And so we've lacked for the better part of a decade, but even going back to the outset of the internet, that kind of strategic classification online where the next generation can really become confident in reputable sources being the bedrock of search. And we know that our young people today, especially the post-millennials, are deeply attached to smartphones, electronic devices, and digital online search, whether that's Snapchat messages, SMS messages being exchanged, or navigating on browsers on your smartphone. That is really the dominant source of news and information. So we want it to be real news and information and not dis or misinformation. In closing, I just say I was encouraged by the open exchange of ideas I had with the students and thinking about that quest for a post-partisan citizenship. And I don't want you to leave this presentation, I don't know what's going to happen next, Gene, but the next 5 minutes or 3 minutes or however much time I have left without you recognizing that this state voted for Harry Truman, this state voted for Lyndon Johnson. If you don't believe that a post-partisan politics, or at least a rejiggering of our politics, is possible, you haven't studied American history. You haven't studied the Democratic and Republican parties and the tumult experience and the change of character of those parties in terms of positions, in terms of worldview. And sometimes it's tied to allegiance to the party in power, the president in power. Sometimes it's tied to elements on the ground. And I don't want to leave here without telling you that I received an alert from a reputable news outlet as I was coming on stage, and I wanted to share it with you. And that was, it was from the New York Times, and it was stating a fact that the president touts. Unemployment is down and the economy is strong. And it was alluding to the markets in particular, broadly speaking. And it goes on to say, but for Americans without much education, the jobs they can get may not pay enough to live. I think that the most uncivil condition of all that Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump recognized, I think Bernie Sanders in this very auditorium, was that we were being degraded by a kind of cannibalistic capitalism that was overtaking us. That wasn't quite the messaging that Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump used, but they definitely said that in their own words, in their own messaging. And in the minute now that I have left, I want to emphasize to you, this question is not the most uncivil condition at all. The grave, grave inequities that we've experienced and the fact that in response to public policy, whether it's the corporate tax cuts or other tax cuts we've had in recent years, wage growth for everybody, except really the top tier of America, it's just gone like this, stagnant or barely up, sometimes down for folks. And that's not just true of people without higher education, that's true of people with higher education. And I think that it's here in Missouri, where Gene said I spoke last semester, and in these states where we have to reframe the issues and understand what it means to be civil again. The dignity of our society, the dignity of our children and our families, I think it depends on recognizing that there is not a socialistic or communistic or whatever threat to this union. There is a quest, and I think the quest for a post-partisan politics will be born in a quest for a compassionate capitalistic society. And if that is the rhetoric emanated from Senate candidates or maybe a presidential candidate in 2020, whether it's a Republican or Democrat, I think that that strategy will not only be effective for their political future, but it will help preserve the fundamental fabric of the society, which I would insist and promise you is civil society, civil rights, civil disobedience, civil discourse. With that, I want to thank you for your attention this evening, and I look forward to answering your questions.
So before we get to Q&A, those of us who organized this and invited Alexander to the University of Wyoming thought it'd be really interesting to bring 3 more local voices to the questions that were posed this evening. So I'd like to start with you, Marilyn. Let me just remind folks that Marilyn served 3 terms in the Wyoming Supreme Court, and one of those was as our Chief Justice. So Marilyn, would you start us off?
Well, there's a lot to react to. First of all, I guess I think it's the most positive thing is that we are having this discussion and that we feel the need to address this condition we find ourselves in. It is interesting to me that as you go back over history, there were a lot of times in our country's history where we weren't very civil to each other, and including in the political campaigns and the solicitation of support of one party over another. In preparation for another event, I was reading about the names that Jefferson and Adams called each other, which I can't use here in polite society. So that sometimes I think that comes from a strong belief in your position. If you believe that strongly that you're right, you can get strident. But I think the fear that I have, at least, and I think many of us do, is the reason we need civility is not just because it's a good thing, it's the right thing to do, it's what your mother told you to be. We can't work together, and we've got big problems. So it's the need to create an environment where collaboration and negotiation and, God forbid, compromise can happen. And if we don't have an environment where people are decent to each other, they're not going to find those answers. And whatever side of the political spectrum you're on, it's that part that disturbs me the most. And I think in reaction to what you said, Alexander, about the media's responsibility, it's kind of interesting because I think the media goes to what we as a public are like, or are at least paying attention to. And so we, the voter, we, the person that goes and turns on their television, if we're looking for that kind of entertainment, so to speak, it encourages, I think, an uncivil presentation. And I think also that we will never solve these problems on a national stage, at least not quickly. But we sure can do that on a local level in your school board elections or discussions in your town councils, because that incivility has gone to that level. So in a way, it seems to me that it's our responsibility as individuals, whether it's the consumers of news or the voter, that you make your final decision based upon some strident, uncivil, and in some cases, untrue information, then it's easy to blame those people in office. But I think the responsibility is really a personal one, and that's where we can make a difference. I heard our former governor, Mike Sullivan, say in response to what do we do about this situation, and he said that when he left for school, when he was a child, his parents told him one thing, and that was to be decent. And when you think about it, that's really all we need to do. We can disagree strongly, but we can do it with respect and decency to the person we're disagreeing with.
Tim Stubson. Tim, would you join us in this conversation?
You bet, and thanks for having me. It does the heart good, to see so many people that really care how we as citizens engage and how we move our state and our country forward. And I think as we talk about civility, one of the things that I sort of struggle with is what does that really mean, especially in this context of politics, because, in my mind, sometimes I go to, group hugs and warm fuzzies and that sort of thing, and I don't think that works really in the context of political civility, because, at its heart, politics is a contact sport, and we know it and we see it, and it is a system that is set up to be adversarial. And so, you know, at its core, when politics is about exercising power, if you talk about civility without recognizing it, I think you can come up with maybe solutions that don't really work in the real world. But when I was first in the legislature, I think my first picture of civility happened just within days of me starting in the Wyoming House. And you know, as a new member, there was a Representative Debbie Hammonds, from a Democrat from up in Washakie County. And she was presenting a bill, and a bill that I thought was just a terrible idea. And I was kind of full of vim and vinegar, and I got up and I just slammed that bill, and I took it to task, and I managed to kill the bill. And Debbie was so ticked off at me, as I would be. She'd labored over it for an entire interim, and some punk came in and killed it. And she goes back to her desk, and I go back to mine. And then about 15 minutes later, it was time for me to present my very first bill. And I get up, and I'm standing there, and I'm telling everybody what a great idea it is, and I see out of the corner of my eye Debbie stand up and walk over to the lectern to speak. And I was like, okay, I know this is the way it's going to be, I guess. And Debbie stands up, and she pulls the microphone close, and she says, you know what, this bill is really a great idea. And, you know, she went in, she sold the bill passed, and the bill's now, you know, law in Wyoming. And it just was a great lesson that, you know, if it's about policy, it's not about people. If you can recognize where the fight ends and the humanity begins, that to me is really civility in the political world. And so trying to figure out how we capture that, how we enforce that, how we do that. And one of the things, I'm a lawyer by trade. That's my day job. That's why I'm so well behaved next to Justice Kite. But you know, in the courtroom, it's also an adversarial proceeding, and it's set up to be that way. And I mean, you've got people paying you to advocate for them and to advocate vigorously, not to be polite, not to be nice. So how, when all the incentives are wrong, how do you make that be a system that works? And the fact is, you have rules, and you have rules that are enforced, and that there are consequences for violating those, and it works. I mean, and you see it on the outside boundaries with rules of ethics and professional responsibility, but even narrower, there's a rule we have for our trial courtrooms, Uniform Rule 801, and it's really a be nice rule. And I'm trying, the language of it requires attorneys, anybody involved in the litigation proceedings, to act with candor, courtesy, and civility, and demonstrate personal honesty, fairness, and integrity. And I mean, that's a pretty high standard. But it's enforced, and I've seen judges take lawyers to task when they attack another lawyer personally. And it makes a difference, and it makes that adversarial system work. So how do you do that in politics? That's a little bit of a tougher question, I think. For me, sometimes, I don't think, frankly, that media is in a position to be the arbiter of what is civil necessarily, to set the rules of what civility should be, or to call out necessarily someone for being uncivil and someone for being civil. I think, as Marilyn said, they sort of reflect who we are as voters and as citizens, and I really think that's where it comes down to, as voters. And we've had, in our history, these bright lines in political discourse that you don't go across. And if you do, there's a consequence at the ballot box. And of course, we've seen politicians now on the left and the right steamroll through those boundaries. And I think what's really going to be interesting, maybe over the next 3 election cycles or so, is are we as a people, or are we as voters, are we going to decide that our ends justify any means? Or are we going to decide that, yes, there are certain boundaries we need to enforce to make certain that we as a country can continue to thrive and can continue to discuss? And if we do that, you'll see that at the ballot box. And as soon as those seeking elections start losing because of that conduct, you're going to see a change in the conduct.
Affie, you're up.
What they said, thank you. In all seriousness, I want to thank the University of Wyoming for having this dialogue and conversation, because it's very important, and it's actually a reason I ran. I ran in the 2016 election, and I remember watching the news, and I saw candidates shouting at each other. And, you know, I'm a mom of 3 kids, and so I'll talk a lot about my kids, and a lot of my lessons are really inspired by them, but I didn't like what they were seeing on TV. And so I thought, you know, I can't make a difference at the national level, but certainly I can make a difference in my own state. And so since being elected, I've given a lot of thought to what this word civility really means. And like my other esteemed lawyerly colleagues on the stage, I went to the library in Cheyenne, and I looked up the word civility to find titles of books that would maybe give me some framework, maybe give you a good Webster's definition of what that word means. But my takeaway was kind of startling. I found George Washington's Rules of Civility alongside a copy of Miss Manners, Saves Civilization, and those were the two books that I found about civility, and they were in the etiquette aisle of the library. And then I started scrolling some other book titles that were in the political section, and I saw titles like this one, Bloodthirsty Bitches and Pious Pimps of Power. And it was really sad. There's no shortage of these kind of titles on the bookshelf. And so I think if any of you aspiring young writers out there want to craft a book that people might need to read, it would be about civility, because we really don't have a lot of good books out there. So thinking about what this means, since being elected, I've had my fair share of critics, people who have reached out to me. And one lady said, well, you signed up for this. And I'm going to tell you this flat out. No, I did not. I signed up to spend a lot of time away from my family, to take on another, what could be full-time job on top of my profession as a lawyer. And that's a lot of work, and that's what I signed up for, was trying to do something good for Wyoming. I didn't sign up for personal attacks or vulgar remarks. So if you are one of those kind of people, I'm just going to flat out tell you, no, we did not sign up for that. As I talked to my kids about what civility means, and they asked on the car ride over here, the best example I can give is, what's your favorite color? And in asking my kids that, I've heard, the variety of reasons why my daughter loves blue, why my son loves red. I explained to them why I love orange. And it made me think about that's how we should be talking about politics and our political views. There was never one part of me that said, well, you love blue, you must hate America, and you're the stupidest person I've ever met. Or how someone would criticize me for having orange as my favorite color. And so I wish we had political conversations that were much more civil about how we talk about our favorite colors or what our favorite movies are. So something to think about. And again, another kind of golden rule that I talk about with my kids is, if you can't say something nice, don't say it at all. I think in politics, as a public official, my rule is if you can't say it to my face, then don't say it at all. Because I've found that whenever I've approached critics who are very, bold in social media posts or sending me emails, they have a very difficult time looking me in the eye. And so I think, as you're standing there, maybe reading an article on Facebook and you want to throw a comment out there, take a time to think about whether or not you would feel comfortable saying those words in front of your grandmother or to the intended recipient. I have a ton of notes, but part of, I think, the solution is really asking folks to articulate their positions. And I hear a lot of people say, I hate so-and-so, that guy's a bozo, they're idiots, they don't know anything. We're in a college auditorium, and so maybe this message doesn't resonate with a lot of folks, but hopefully it resonates with the people in this room and the people who are taking the time to listen to this program or watch it. Articulate. I disagree with President Trump's policy on XYZ. I disagree with Senator so-and-so's statement or handling of whatever situation. And I really feel like whenever I hear people say, I don't know what to do about civility, I can honestly say the answer's right there. And every person has a responsibility to take it to heart and decide if they want to be part of the conversation to enhance civility or not. So whenever you're feeling distraught that there's nothing you can do, there's absolutely stuff you can do. And if you want to expand that activism beyond how you speak, call it out when you see it. If you see a letter to the editor in the newspaper, a comment on social media that is less than civil, call it out. And we all deserve better. So I think I could go on and on. I've got a few more notes on the page, but I'll stop there. But I did want to add one thing because Tim mentioned it when he was talking about etiquette and rules in the courtroom. I was just reading a case from 1970 that the U.S. Supreme Court considered. And in that case, a man was going to be sentenced to prison for a variety of crimes he committed. And he wanted to represent himself. And during his trial, he kept insulting the judge, was being disruptive, wasn't following the rules of etiquette and the decorum that the court required. And so the judge expelled him. and the Supreme Court reviewed it because as a citizen of this country, you have a right to confront your accusers if they're trying to send you to jail. And so he made that argument that he was being denied a constitutional right. And the court said, you know, that's true, but the only way that this works is if we have some decorum and we have some rules of etiquette. And so they held his case was valid and he was sentenced to time. But it really did have me thinking about the importance of etiquette, politeness, manners, rules. And I know that sounds a little like old-fashioned, but maybe that's what we need.
Alexander, would you maybe weigh in?
Sure. Thank you all. Thank you for those insights. I would just say in response collectively, I echo a number of those sentiments. I would add from a conversation in the classroom today that we should state I agree or I disagree. As was just mentioned, I also think we need to take it a step further because a young lady who voted for President Trump and I had a nice exchange in which she asked me, well, how do you recognize in conversation when you don't want to alienate someone or potentially lose a friend in the college campus environment, and answer that question. And I brought up an episode of my program I did with a scholar from the University of Wisconsin-Madison on resentment in politics and how the best way to get at it you know, is really to look at the causal relationship and to reach a point of comfort with your constituents or your neighbors, your peers, where an answer to a question is not, I voted for Secretary Clinton or I voted for President Trump because they care about me. And if that is your definition of politics, I think that's a sad reflection of sort of, you know, just in kind of egomaniacal, narcissistic view of you know, who we are as a people. And so thinking about voting through the lens of, you know, policies that advantage or disadvantage my community, but thinking about it through the lens of those policies and not through the lens of animus towards any single group. And then I would just add with respect to, you know, anonymity and Jefferson and Adams, I think that's a point well taken, but you know, they were actually delivering those messages through their emissaries and anonymously and not face-to-face in the way that, you know, Donald Trump would say crooked Hillary and then she would say delete your account. You know, and representing those as human beings is a world of difference, I think, than what was documented as kind of the infamous scribblers of our founding. And there's sure as hell a lot of anonymous quotes, and we deserve people with the integrity who are going to stand behind real thought processes, real convictions, real assertions. And that couldn't be more important for, I think, my line of work to recognize. In the same vein, we've kind of normalized it to the point where I do think we're going to be successful with candidates who represent that restoration of civil norms and demonstrations of them, like we just heard, in decorum, in conduct, in policy. And the final thing I'd say is I kind of do connect civility to policy insofar as, you know, there is the definition of civility that is decorum and decency, but then there's the definition of civility and what is sort of dignified and human dignity. And that's why I kind of concocted this phrase in a piece that I wrote during the New Hampshire primary cycle, trickle-down discourse. Because I think it infuses in the civility crisis this reality that we don't have enough economic empowerment as citizens. And that seemed to be a consensus from the candidates who ran in 2016, and they may be betraying that promise, but I think that you'll see a revival of that message in 2020 because of that New York Times article that I referenced and the real data to back it up.
Hi, I'm Xavier Peterson. I'm a senior here at Laramie High School. My question is also for the entire panel. As has been said, people will throw out all kinds of insults and things online, email, whatever, and come time to talk in person, they can't even look you in the eye, they'll stumble over their words, they don't want to say it. And from what I've seen, that largely comes from a sense of invulnerability and anonymity online. People hide behind their username, or they hide behind a fake email address, something like that, so you can't contact them again. And I was just wondering what you all think is the best way to hold those people accountable to what they say online. Thank you.
Go ahead, Marilyn.
I probably shouldn't even answer this question because I'm incompetent, because I'm not online on most of these questions. But I guess my thought would be to ignore them. You can't hold them accountable. There's no way to know who they are. And if we let them have an impact on policy or on our own happiness or lives, we're giving them power. So that would be my comment, ignore them.
First of all, I want to thank all of you for participating and all of you for coming.